morning. How are you? I'm glad you're here today. We're beginning a brand new series that I'm excited about called Love Your Neighbor, okay? And it's going to be a challenging series for us to take to heart some of the words of Jesus about loving our neighbor. And I want to begin this morning with a quote from a psychologist, a famous psychologist, Stanford University, Dr. Philip Zimbardo. He is now retired from there. He's 86 years old, but he's a professor of psychology emeritus. And he says this: I know no more potent killer than isolation. There's no more destructive influence on physical and mental health than the isolation of you from me and us from them. It has been shown to be a central agent in the etiology of depression, paranoia, schizophrenia, rape, suicide, mass murder, and a wide variety of disease states. Now, these come from a well-respected clinical psychologist who has seen this for years in his practice. This is a man who has dealt with folks who deal with such isolation and the results of it. And what I've noticed today in our culture, and I've been noticing this for the last few years, we are becoming less of a share and share alike culture. We're becoming more isolated from each other. We like our independence, but we get caught up in the corporate structures of work and life. And even though we like our independence, okay, we still feel we're alone. For example, have you ever noticed joggers? They love their independence, but they want to stay connected. They have their headsets going with music, all right? And our watchword today is privacy. Our commitments are short-term. I call it the elevator syndrome. I've been at the hospital a lot this week, almost every day, seeing folks, and I love waiting to be the last one to get on the elevator. And this week, every elevator I got on, they were full. I mean, packed. You could barely get in there. You know how it is? You get on there and you turn, and nobody talks. Everybody just looks at the numbers. I like to be the last one on, and I walk and I face everybody. And they always get nervous. And when the doors finally close, they go, hey, how are y'all doing? And they about jump out of their skin. Because we're not supposed to talk in elevators. We're just supposed to stand there, look at the numbers, and step off when it's our turn. And every time I got in a conversation with people. People got on, they had some coffee from Starbucks and coffee from Port City, Java. And I go, man, that smells good. What kind is that? And all of a sudden, we're all talking on the elevator. In fact, one guy got so involved, he missed his floor because we were so engaging, all right? But I call it the elevator syndrome. We don't want to talk to people anymore, okay? There's no eye contact, no smiling, nothing on an elevator anymore. And it got me thinking about a pastor who lived in the 1600s by the name of John Donne. And he wrote these infamous words in 1624. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. We live in one of the most blessed countries in the world, okay? But we also are living, I think, today more isolated than we ever have. Okay? In fact, our contacts today are reduced nothing more than to smartphones. We text each other, we send email messages to each other, and that's about it. Family reunions, well, they're as extinct as the dinosaurs are. And even our jobs cause us to move away from our very roots, causing further isolation. Let me just see. How many of you are not living in the town you grew up in? Look at this. How many are not living in the state you grew up in? Look at this. So you're isolated from family and friends that you knew for years. And then you've had to start all over, but you miss those deep roots. In fact, study after study shows that millennials and Generation Z are the most connected generation ever due to social media and texting. But the data shows that they're the most lonely. Their relationships are shallow. And when asked if they could get an answer to one question, the number one question stated in the survey was, how do you create a meaningful and deep relationship? This generation, millennials and Z, are the most connected. They live on these things, but they're the most lonely. They are the most disconnected. And I believe that God's antidote to this is the church. We've got to start getting involved and engaging in our culture, in our community, in Wilmington and in New Hanover County. We can't afford just to come on Sunday mornings and have our little, what I call holy huddles, and meet here and worship, okay? That's not enough. We got to have more than that, because we bear God's image, and that image is we're to go share Christ with the rest of the world. Over and over in Scripture, it tells us that when Jesus encountered anyone who had an illness, whatever it was, he had compassion for them. I've just given a few references here. 2 blind men come to Jesus in Matthew 20. Numerous sick and people and a huge crowd come to him in Matthew 14. The only son of a widow who had died comes to him in Luke 17. And men with the leprosy come to him in Mark 1. He heals all of them. He raised the dead son. Never do we have a record of them saying thank you. Never do we have a record of them saying, I will follow you. Jesus had compassion on people who most often never said thank you. I want our church to engage in our culture. I want us to get involved in New Hanover County, get involved in Wilmington. You see, even when we come together, as I say, we're not always coming together. Oh, I watch you sometimes, some of you. You come and you find that pew where you don't have to sit close to someone because you think they have the coronavirus, don't you? You're very careful. Now, others of you, you sit in the same spot every week no matter what. That's how I know you're here or not, okay? You're just into routine. I know where you're going to sit, all right? Just coming together and sitting on a pew doesn't mean we're connecting with each other. And I'm thrilled about this series. I really am. But I'm also concerned that the church today is not engaging and getting involved in our culture and our community like it should. Chuck Swindoll puts it this way. Someone has suggested that we, meaning the church, are like a pack of porcupines on a frigid, wintry night. The cold drives us closer together into a tight huddle to keep warm. As we begin to snuggle really close, our sharp quills cause us to jab and prick each other, a condition which then forces us apart. But before long, we start getting cold, so we move back to get warm again, only to stab and puncture each other once more. And so we participate in this strange, rhythmic, tribal dance. We can't deny it. We need each other, but we often needle each other. And I'm thrilled about this series, and I'm excited about this series. We're going to do the whole month of February and going into March of looking how can we love our neighbor? How can we get connected to our culture? So I have a question for you this morning. Here it is. What is the single most important thing to do with your life? Now, if you said, well, love God, give my life to Christ, grow my relationship to God, yes, you'd be right. That's the single most important thing all of us should be doing with our life. Because God didn't put us on this earth just to have a checklist of things to do every week, to make a bunch of money and retire and die. God made us because he loved us and he wants us to love him back. So the main goal of life is learning to love God and learning to grow in our relationship with God. But I have another question for you. Do you know the second most important thing you're supposed to do with your whole life while you're here on this earth? Do you know that one? The first one is you got to get to love God and know God. That is obvious. Jesus was asked this question in Matthew 22. And he gives an answer to what is the second most important thing we are to do with our life. Follow along in Matthew 22, verse 36. He begins this way. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? This Jewish teacher comes up to Jesus and says, hey, give me the Cliff Note version here. Summarize it down for me. What's the most important thing I'm supposed to do with my life? And Jesus said, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and with all your mind and strength. This is the first and greatest commandment. So the number one thing that you and I are supposed to do is learn to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we're to do this every day of our life. We're every day to be getting better and better at loving God and better at knowing God and better at growing our relationship with God. But Jesus didn't stop there. He said, and the second, meaning here's the second most important thing that you and I are to be doing with our life. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. She said, I can summarize the entire Old Testament for you. I can summarize the whole Bible for you in 2 commands. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. You remember at the Last Supper, Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples. It's just hours before he's going to be arrested and eventually killed on the cross. Knowing his imminent death was right at the door, he said these words to his disciples and to us in John 13. And so I'm now giving a new commandment to you. Love each other just as much as I love you. Your strong love for each other will prove to the world that you're my disciples. Jesus didn't say love each other as your mother loves you. He says we're to love each other how? As much as he loves us. In fact, that's why Paul, picking up on the words of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 14:1, said this, let love be your what? Notice he didn't say, let church attendance be your highest goal. Now, you're not off the hook, all right? He didn't say making money be your highest goal. He didn't say have the most friends on Facebook be your highest goal. He said let love be your highest goal in life. Loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. Life's not about accomplishments. It's not about being acclaimed. It's not about possessions, acquisitions, or achievements. Jesus said the greatest goal in life is love. And he summarizes it in what's called the Great Commandment. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to look at this second part. How do we love our neighbor as ourselves? How do we do what Jesus said? Because Jesus said the key in love is you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love your neighbor how? What does that mean? How do you love your neighbor as yourself? Well, we're going to look at what that means over the next few weeks. Okay? I think all of us are pretty much amateurs at loving our neighbor as ourselves. I don't think most of us are great at loving our neighbor. And we're going to even look who our neighbor is. I don't think I love my neighbor as I should. I don't think you love your neighbor as you should. But Jesus said this is the second greatest commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. And it's interesting, he doesn't mention it once in the scriptures or twice in the scriptures or 5 times in the scriptures. Jesus mentions it 10 times in scriptures. 7 times directly he says, love your neighbor as yourself. And 3 other times he mentions it indirectly. So to me, if God says we're to do something 10 times in scripture, we should be doing it. Don't you think so? I mean, this is emphatic. He wants to make sure we get this. He wants us to learn to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So how in the world do you do that? How in the world do I do that? Well, that's what we're going to look at over the next few weeks. What does this mean? I want you to get the reputation to being the most loving person people know. I want when you walk into that restaurant you go into all the time, the server's good. Now, that's the most loving person I know. When you walk into get some gas, and the attendant points, that's the most loving person I know. When you walk into here, I want people pointing at you and going, that's the most loving person I know. I want our church to have the reputation as, that's the most loving church I know. I want them to name you by name. I want them to look at you and come up to you and say, you're the most loving person I know. In fact, Paul understood this, and he emphasized it as well. This second commandment of Jesus. In Galatians 5, he says this, for the whole law can be summed up in this one command, love your neighbor how? As yourself. So we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I hope you won't miss any of these messages. Because we're going to look at what does this mean for us individually and what does it mean for us as a church. Because Jesus said this is the second most important thing you can do with your life. The first is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second most important thing you can do, and he says, is equal to the first. You can't love God and not love your neighbor as yourself, he says. In fact, to teach us what this means, he gave a story called a parable, called the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's probably the most famous parable in Scripture. In fact, there are thousands of hospitals all over the world named the Good Samaritan Hospital in different cities. We see it in movies, we see it in literature. This story is played out because it's so powerful for what it means. And it teaches us how we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. In Luke 10, we have a Jewish scholar of Mosaic law who comes up to Jesus and he asks him a question similar to what the Matthew Jewish teacher did. So follow along as I read it for you. In Luke 10, verse 25, it says, a teacher of the law came up and tried to trap Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to receive eternal life? So it's kind of a debate question. It's a trick question. Jesus, I want to know, how do I get into heaven? And look what Jesus answered him. Jesus answered him, what do the scriptures say? All right, you are the scholar on Mosaic law, so what does the Old Testament say? How do you interpret them? The man answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And what? Love your neighbor as yourself. I want you to circle that phrase, as you love yourself. So even this Jewish scholar of Mosaic law comes to try to trap Jesus. He knows the law. You love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself. Now, Jesus didn't say, just be nice to people or be kind to people. He says, you got to love them as much as you love yourself. Right? Now look at verse 28. Jesus said, you are right, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But the teacher of the law wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? I love it. I love open-ended questions, especially when they're asked of Jesus, because he's not going to miss the opportunity to answer them. And what he's doing here, this Jewish scholar, is trying to find a loophole. He's really saying to Jesus, all right, who is my neighbor? Please tell me I don't have to love the people I dislike. So Jesus, when you say love my neighbors, are you just meaning all my friends on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat? When you mean neighbor, do you mean the people who live across the street from me? In the apartments with me? I really don't know what neighbor means. Could you define what a neighbor is? And so Jesus does in this story. In the story of the Good Samaritan found in Luke 10, Jesus teaches him and he teaches us who our neighbor is. And in the story, you know it, there's a Jewish guy who's been mugged, he's been beaten up, he's been stripped of his clothing, he's naked, and he's been left for dead. And three different people come by. One's a Jewish priest, one's a Jewish Levite, and one is a Samaritan. And the mistake that most people make when they read this story is to think that Jesus is talking about three different types of people who see this beaten up guy. No, he's talking about three different responses we can have to our neighbor. And so in the story, we're going to look at the responses, and then today we're going to look at two ways we can start loving our neighbor, and next week when we come back, we'll look at two more ways we can love our neighbor. So what I want you to see are these responses. Here's the first response. I can keep my distance. This is the attitude of avoidance. I can just simply keep my distance, avoid them, stay away, not have anything to do with them. And that's what the priest does. In verse 30, Jesus answered, there was once a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when robbers attacked him, stripped him, and beat him up, leaving him half dead. So let me put this in context for you. If you ever get to go to the Mideast and you want to travel from Jerusalem to Jericho, Jerusalem sits up on a mound. It's up on a big hill. They like to say it's a mountain. It's really a mound. But to get to Jericho, you got to go down. You got to go downhill. You got to go down the elevation. It's kind of like if you ever go to Boone to go skiing, and you want to get to go down 421. You got to go down 421 to get to I-40. You go downhill. Same thing. But this area was known because the road had all these crevices and it winded around. Robbers and thieves would hide in crevices, and they would often beat up people, mug them, and steal their possessions, steal their money. So if you ever took that road, you did it with great risk. And sometimes you had to take it because you had to get to somewhere quickly. But everyone who traveled it was aware there was the potential they could be beaten up. And Jesus said, this is what happened to this Jewish man. For whatever reason, he had to get from Jerusalem down to Jericho. Now look at verse 31. It so happened that a priest was going down that road, but when he saw the man, he walked on by the other side. It says, it so happened. I want you to circle that. It so happened. We're going to come back to that. Okay? So we have a Jewish priest who's coming down the same road. Okay? He sees the man. The man's way over here on the other side of the road, but he just looks at him and he sees him. He sees he's beaten up, mugged, naked, and left to die. He just avoids them. And this is the tendency we see today among people who are Christians. We see people in need, but we just avoid them. We don't want to take the time. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. It's the attitude that says this: don't get too close to people in your life because they may need your help. They may ask you for help. Keep all your relationships superficial so that you don't have to get involved. That way you don't have to be involved in their hurt and their pain. Keep your distance. Be distracted. Don't let people get close to you, because if they get close to you, you may have to help them. You may have to get involved in their lives. You don't have to get to know your neighbors. You don't have to get close to your neighbors. You can keep your distance from the people you work with and you go to school with, who live around you. In fact, even our own houses today add to this isolation and avoidance. I want to show you another quote from Philip Zimbardo. He says this: the well-tended front lawn is the modern moat that keeps the barbarians at bay. In Wilmington, it's very common. We do this in our house. I've always told Audrey, when we buy a house that has a garage, the garage is not for her to put stuff in. Okay? It's to put cars in. Now, in our house, our two attics are sagging from the weight. Okay? So we've always been pulled right into our garage. And think about it. You pull in your driveway, you hit a click, the door goes up. You go in, you hit a click, the door comes down. You don't have to talk to anybody. You don't have to see anybody. You don't have to relate to anybody. You just click, you're in, click, and the door is closed. Now, Audrey and I, we have great neighbors. They're wonderful families, but there are times we can go weeks and we never see them. I might see them getting the mail. I might see them at times taking trash out. And it's easy for us to live in this click life where we avoid people because we have to get somewhere. We got to be someplace. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And it's easy for us to live in New Hanover County and stay uninvolved. Avoid the people who are right around us. In fact, less than 7 miles from our church is the poorest part of our city. It's called Creekwood. It's called Creekwood. It's actually 6.8 miles from our church. Will our church do anything to reach out to the people in Creekwood? Are we just going to avoid them because they're poor black families in there? Because they're illegals in there? Do these folks need Jesus Christ? Can we build a bridge to this community? Or are we just going to stay on this side of Market Street because nobody goes on the other side of Market except for my wife, who teaches right next to Creekwood? We have an opportunity right here to build a bridge. Racial tensions are still strong in this city. Racism is still strong in this city. We need to build a bridge to Creekwood, not because we're white, but because we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. So we can avoid them, and we can avoid anyone. Or we can do the second thing. Here's the second response I can have to the people around me. I can be curious, but uninvolved. This is the attitude of being apathetic. I can be curious, but I can certainly not get involved. And this is the attitude of being apathetic. And in the story, we have another guy who comes along. The Jewish guy's already gone on his way. He's happily on his way. He saw the guy. He didn't do anything. He just saw him. But now we have another guy. He's a Levite. Look at this in verse 32. In the same way, a Levite also came there. Now get this. He sees this guy all beaten up, mugged, naked, left for dead, but he does something. He walks over and looks at him. He's curious. He looked at the man, and then what? He walked on by. He walks over here, looks at him. What happened here? Dude, somebody beat you up. Where are your clothes? And he walks away. Now, his response is worse than the first guy. The first guy didn't even walk over. This guy walks over and sees this guy left for dead and does nothing. I mean, he's got on his great robes of self-righteousness. Here's what I've learned about religion. Religion does not make you loving. You can be religious and go to a church service every week of your life and never love your neighbors yourself. This guy he's a Levite, which means he's a leader in the temple. He leads worship. He leads worship. He walks over and, what happened to this dude? My. God bless you. He's curious, but uninvolved. It's kind of like when you're driving down College Road and you see an accident and the emergency people aren't there yet. What do? You stare, but you don't stop. See, we love to stare. We just hate to stop. And when we're driving down College Road, if there's no medical team there, we just look, oh my gosh, look at those cars, how bad they are. And we just keep going. And we love to look at people's pain. We love to gossip about people's pain. We love to talk to other people about other people's pain. And we love to read about it. I mean, People magazine. What is it about? People's pain. There's all these magazines you can pick up and read it that are about scandals and problems. It's all gossip. Oh, we love to read about the pain in other people's lives. We love to read about the scandals. I mean, the impeachment has had top ratings because people love a scandal. They just don't want to love the people in the scandal. There's a big difference. See, we love to talk about it. We love to read about it. We love to gossip about it. We're kind of like the Levi. We get curious, but we don't get involved. Here's the third response we see in the story. I can treat them how I want to be treated. These are the attitudes of being sympathetic and empathetic. The people in your neighborhood who live next to you, you can treat them the way you would like to be treated. The people you work with, you can treat them the way you want to be treated. The people you go to school with, you could treat them the way you want to be treated. The kid who bags your groceries, you could treat him the way you would want to be treated. The girl that checked you out of the department store, you could treat her the way you'd want to be treated. You could treat the servers the way you would want to be treated. Or you can just keep your distance. You could be curious and uninvolved. And Jesus gives someone who does this in verse 33. But a Samaritan who was traveling that way came upon the man, and when he saw him, his heart was filled with pity. Now look what Jesus says next, because this is going to blow this Jewish scholar's mind. It's just going to blow him out, okay? Look what he says next. Now the Samaritan, he went over to him, poured oil and wine on his wounds, and bandaged them. And then he put the man on his own animal and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Take care of him, he told the innkeeper, and when I come back this way, I will pay you whatever else you spend on him. When I read that, I thought, if Jesus was telling this story today, it would be like an African American coming down the street and he sees this KKK guy all beaten up, bloodied, left for dead. And he pulls over and he helps him. You see, Samaritans and Jews were enemies. They hated each other. And Jesus intentionally told the story this way. Of all the people, the priest or the Levite should have helped, and they didn't. The Samaritan, this is the shock. He knows what this Jewish guy who's beaten up thinks about him. He knows the racial remarks he's made against him. He knows he thinks he's better than everybody else. Jews hated and despised Samaritans. And I've imagined when Jesus told this story to this Mosaic law expert, he probably responded with, "Shut my mouth, you got to be kidding me. There's no way a Samaritan would help a Jew." And here's what I noticed. Jesus takes who's been racially prejudiced against and biased against, who's been ethnically rejected. He says, this is the guy who showed him love. This guy treats the man the way he wants to be treated. This Samaritan who takes the wine and the oil. This Samaritan who's been hated all of his life. This is the guy who showed him love. Jesus turns the tables. He turns the tables on this Jewish scholar, Mosaic law, because Jews hated Samaritans. Jews were racially prejudiced because they had been these Jews that were now Samaritans. These Jews were pure-blooded, but they intermarried when they got conquered. So they were tainted. They had mixed blood. And what I find interesting is that Jesus picked the most despised person to a Jew to be the hero of the story. Why? To teach us who our neighbor really is. Your neighbor's the person or people you dislike or are prejudiced against or who you think is beneath you or you have an issue against. So who's that for you? Who is that neighbor that you keep your distance from? I mean, like the priest in the parable, you see their need, but you just avoid it and do nothing. Or like the Levite, you're curious, you learn about their need, but you do nothing about it. Who's that neighbor? Who's your neighbor that when you learn about their problems and their pain, you're just apathetic towards? Jesus, in Matthew 7, says this: always treat others as you would have them treat you. We call that what? The golden rule. You see, we need to start living out the golden rule. I want our church to have the reputation of being the most loving church in this city. And if we're going to learn to love our neighbor as ourselves, let me give you two things you can start with today that you can take out the door with you. Here's the first thing you can start doing. I must see their needs. If I'm going to love my neighbor as myself, I got to first see their needs. This is called the principle of sensitivity. I have to be sensitive. Love is sensitive. I want to have to see their needs. Love begins with looking at what's wrong. Love starts in the eye. You can't meet a need until you know there's a need. And if you don't see the need, you can't meet the need. But once you're aware of the need and you do nothing, then you're apathetic. It begins with observation. So I got to see their needs. I got to be sensitive to their needs. Let's go back to the parable of the Good Samaritan. In Luke 10:33, Jesus says this: but a Samaritan who was traveling that way came upon the man, and when he saw him, his heart was filled with pity. I want you to circle that phrase, when he saw him. He doesn't just notice there's a guy beaten up. He notices there's a guy who needs help. Friends, there are wounded people all around you right now. There are wounded people sitting in the pew with you. They're wounded physically or financially or emotionally. They're wounded intellectually. They're wounded relationally. They're wounded by the greed of others. They've been wounded by their parents. They've been wounded and betrayed by someone else. They're wounded by grief. There are wounded people all around you right now. Do you see them? Do you want to see them? You don't have to open your eyes to it. You can just come and sit, do your little thing, fill in your blanks, and leave the door. See, I don't think most of us don't care. I don't think that most of us are cold-hearted. I think the number one reason you don't see the needs of the people around you, and I'll give it to you in one single word: busyness. You're just too busy. That's why you don't see the needs of the people around you. You're running here, you're running there, you're running like a chicken with your head cut off. You're always running behind. You're flying down College Road like it's a drag strip. You just got to get there, just got to get there, just got to get there. And it's not that you don't care, it's just you're too busy. James Dobson of Focus on the Family tells a true story about a man he just recently had a conversation with. He said when this man, who's now 58, was in high school, he was the star athlete for the football team. He always tried to get his father to come to the games, and his father was always too busy trying to build a career, trying to take care and provide for his family. And his team made it all the way to the state championship game. And he begged, he pleaded his father to come. Please come and watch me play. He looked over as the game was about 10 minutes from starting and noticed his dad walked in with 2 other men. They were all dressed in suits. They stood there and they talked for a minute. And then his father left with the 2 men. This man told James Dobson, this story happened 40 years ago. And as he told it, tears streamed down his face. He said, it's a horrible thing to have a father who's so busy making money, he doesn't have time to make a son. And he said, Dr. Dobson, my father recently died. And I went up to his open coffin, and here's what I said to my dad. Dad, I never really knew you. We could have shared so much love together, but because you were always so busy, you never had time for me. Busyness kills kindness. Busyness kills love. The busier you get, the less loving you're going to be. Busyness kills love. Busyness can keep you away from your kids. You can't love your kids and your wife and your husband and your neighbors if you're never there. You can't love the people you work with, you go to school with. Oh, you're there personally in physical form, but if you're not engaging with them, you can't love them. Because the busier you get, the less loving you will be. Jesus said this in verse 33. When he saw him, his heart was filled with pity. You and I see people like this all the time. And we think, I'm just in a hurry. I don't have time. Next time I'll help somebody. If you're going to help people, you got to slow down. I've traveled all over the world. I've traveled around the United States. And if I wanted Audrey and Emmy to see the United States, the best way is not in a plane at 35,000 feet flying 575 miles an hour. Just a little trivia here. That's your average speed in a jet airliner if you want to know that, okay? It's 575 miles an hour, right? Oh, we'll see vast landscapes, but we won't see America. If I really want Audrey and Emmy to see America, the best way is by car. Get in the car, drive to the Grand Canyon. Drive to the Grand Tetons. Drive to some of the wonderful places in America. That's how you see America. But listen, you can't do it fast. You got to slow down. You got to take your time. The greater the distance and the faster I go, the less we see. The slower I go, the more I stop, the more we see. You see, this Good Samaritan was sensitive. He sees the needs. And to be sensitive like Jesus, I've got to slow down. Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians 10:24. Do not seek what is best for you at the expense of another. See, we're always looking at what's best for us. But do you do it at the expense of others? Some people are naturally turned into the emotions. Some women, people are just naturally tuned into emotions. And the best people I know are women. Now, don't misunderstand me. I've met some very cold-hearted women who is all about the bottom line, the money. They do what's best for them at the expense of others. But overwhelming, most women are very sensitive. And what's natural for them is to be sensitive to the needs of people. And guys, we're not naturally sensitive to our wife and our kids. So we need to pray, Lord, help me be more sensitive to the people around me, especially to my wife and my kids. Give me a radar to see what's going on with them. And whether you're a woman or a man, sensitivity is something you got to learn. Love starts by looking. This Samaritan saw him, he went over to him, and then he helped. I read about a nurse who put it this way. The essence of great nursing is anticipating people's pain. The essence of a great Christian is the same thing. So I got a question for you. How sensitive are you to your neighbors, to the people who live around you in your own neighborhood, at your work, at your school? Well, you might say, well, I'm very sensitive to them. But I ask, well, what if I ask them? They may say, well, they don't know diddity squat about me. They don't know really who I am. They know my name. They know who we are, but they don't know me. If I were to ask the people you work with, are you a sensitive person? What would they say? If I ask the people you bank with, you shop in the same places, are you a sensitive person? If I were to ask you right now to write down the name of one unbeliever, someone who doesn't know Jesus yet, that you see on a weekly basis, would you be able to write that down? You probably say, well, I could probably write that down. Let me ask you this. Do you know where they hurt? Do you know what their problems are? Do you know what their pain is? That's what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's the essence of what Jesus was teaching here. Oh, we could write their name down maybe, or describe them. It's the blonde-headed 16-year-old kid at Food Line. I don't know if his name's Jeff, Fred, Norman. I don't know. See, when I walk through the checkout counter, I always look at the name. Sarah, how are you doing today? She seems shocked because nobody cares about how Sarah's doing. She's just a minimum wage teenage girl working, bagging my groceries, right? That's all who she is, right? That's not who she is to Jesus, and that's not who she should be to us. See, if we say I'm sensitive to my neighbors, but I don't know their problems, I don't know their pain, then we don't love them as we love ourselves. Look what Paul writes in Galatians 6:8. The person who plants selfishness, ignoring the needs of others, harvests a crop of weeds, and all he'll have to show for his life is weeds. When you die, is all you're going to have to show to God is a bunch of weeds? See, it's about being sensitive. It's about responding to their needs. Jesus said, if you want to learn to love me, you got to love everybody else. Here's the second thing you can do this week to love your neighbor as yourself. I must sympathize and empathize with their pain. You got to sympathize and empathize with their pain. Now, on your outline, the next feeling is above that, so just don't worry about it. I was moving things around. I got it messed up. So if you download this from our website, it's corrected. But sensitivity starts with the eyes. Empathy starts in the heart. My emotions have to kick in. I've always been curious, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy? I've had people tell me different things, so I thought, well, let's go to Webster. How does Webster define this? Sympathy is feeling compassion, sorrow, or pity for the hardships that another person encounters. That's maybe the priest. That might have been the Levite. Empathy is putting yourself in the shoes of another, asking yourself, if this was me, how would I feel? So that the result is you do something about it. That's the Samaritan. Paul writes in Romans 12:15 this, weep with those who weep. Let's go back to the Good Samaritan, verse 33. Jesus said this, when he saw him, his heart was filled with pity. The Greek word that's translated there for pity is a big, long Greek word, splachizomai. You got to have your polygrip in to say that word, all right? Because your dentures will come flying out, all right? The word means to be moved in one's intestines and bowels and entrails. It's a very powerful word that creates powerful emotions. Today we might say, I felt this in my gut, or I got kicked in the gut by this. Meaning we do not recover from such powerful emotions till we do something about it. For the Samaritans, his eyes first kick in. He sees, so he has sympathy. He goes over, and then his heart kicks in. He has empathy. Guys, we need to be more sensitive to our wives and our children. Like I said, by nature, we're not that sympathetic. And if you are, God bless you as a husband, as a father, but most guys are not. Audrey's always telling me, you heard me, but you're not listening to me. How do I have sympathy and empathy? One word, listen. Listening is the key to sympathy. I've got to learn to listen to Audrey, and I've got to learn to listen to Emmy. I know you guys, you say, oh, I listen to my wife. Oh, really? Let me ask your wives. You know, when you were first dating, you sat across the table in that restaurant and you were just all googly-eyed, and she would say something, and you go, now, what do you mean by that? And she'd explain, and she'd say something, oh, really, that's awesome, that's fantastic, that's great, and you just go on and go on. But 10 years later, you're sitting at that same table, and guys, all you hear is wah, 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 wah. Do you know what I'm talking about? The guys are afraid to be honest, wives. They know exactly what I'm talking about. I hear her, but I'm not listening to her. Listening is active. Hearing is passive. So, guys, we need to pray, God, help me. Like on those first few days, I really listened to my wife, to listen to her now. Help me to listen to what my children are telling me. And here's why. Every single person has several fundamental needs. 2 of them are to be understood and validated. You need a person to say, hey, I understand what you're talking about. You need someone to say to you, hey, you're not crazy. I've been where you are. I have felt what you have felt. I've been there. So you need to be understood and you need to be validated. And loving our neighbor means we understand them and we validate them. You're not loving your neighbor as yourself until you are understanding and you validate. I came across a poem by a guy named Leo Biscaglia. He writes this. When I ask you to listen to me and you start giving me advice, you have not done what I asked. When I ask you to listen to me and you begin to tell me why I shouldn't feel that way, you trample on my feelings. When I ask you to listen to me and you feel you have to say something or do something to solve my problem, you have failed me, strange as that may seem. Listen. All I ask is that you listen. Don't talk or do anything. Just hear me. Advice is cheap. 20 cents will get you both Dear Abby and Billy Graham in the same newspaper. And I can do that for myself. I'm not helpless. Maybe discouraged, maybe faltering, but not helpless. When you do something for me that I can and need to do for myself, you contribute to my fear of inadequacy. But when you accept me as a simple fact that I feel what I feel no matter how irrational, then I can stop trying to convince you and get about this business of understanding what's behind this irrational feeling. And when that's clear and the answers are obvious and I don't need advice, irrational feelings make sense when we understand what's behind them. So please, just listen. Just hear me. And if you want to talk, wait a minute for your turn and I will listen to you. A number of years ago, I read a great book by Joe Bailey. It's called The View from a Hearse. He had lost his father, and he tells this. After they had gotten back from the funeral, he says, I was sitting, torn by grief. Someone came and talked to me about God's dealings of why it happened, of hope beyond the grave. He talked constantly, and he said things that I knew were true, but I was unmoved, except to wish that he'd go away. And he finally did. Another came to me and sat down beside me. He didn't talk. He didn't ask leading questions. He just sat beside me for an hour. And he just listened when I did share something. He prayed simply, and then he left. And I was moved. I was comforted. And I hated to see him go. We have to see their need. And with that need, we have to sympathize. We have to empathize. We can't just feel sorry. We got to ask, if I was in the same situation, how would I feel? Paul writes this in Galatians 6. Share each other's troubles and problems, and this way you obey the law of Christ. Some translations put it, bear each other's burdens. The Greek word that's used there for bear or share, depending on your translation, is baptazo. It literally means to take up with the hands heavy loads that are difficult to carry in order to put that weight upon yourself. It's interesting that Paul writes this in the present tense, which means this is something Christians are to do continually, and we're to do this consistently. We're to find ways we can bear each other's burdens. We're to find ways we're to bear the burdens of our neighbors. In other words, you and I should be seeking neighbors, especially neighbors that are lost, and help bear their burden. Help carry that burden with them. Remember what we read earlier in Galatians 5:14. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. So every time you share my sorrows and my pain, you help me with that. When you're sympathetic and you're empathetic with anyone, you help bear that burden. And what is the law of Christ? Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the law of Christ. Jesus says this in Matthew 23. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees are the authorized interpreters of Moses' law. So you must obey and follow everything they tell you to do. Do not, however, imitate their actions, because they don't practice what they preach. They tie onto people's backs loads that are heavy and hard to carry, yet they aren't willing to even to lift a finger to help them carry those loads. So when it comes to your neighbors, the people you work with, you go to school with, the kid behind the counter who's bagging your groceries, I've got a question for you. Do I increase or decrease that load they are carrying? Am I increasing or decreasing the load of the people I go to church with, who I worship with? Am I increasing or decreasing the load of my neighbors? Jesus said, love your neighbors yourself. And what does he mean? When I'm thirsty, I go get something to drink. When I'm hungry, I go get something to eat. When I'm sick, I go see a doctor. So to love our neighbor as ourselves means however I go about meeting my needs, I'm to do that for my neighbor as well. James puts it this way. If you know anyone who doesn't have clothes or food, you shouldn't say, I hope all goes well for you. I hope you will be warm and have plenty to eat. What good is it to say this unless you do something to help? Faith that doesn't lead us to do good deeds is all alone and dead. So as we wrap up, let's go back to the story of the Good Samaritan. In verse 36, it says, and Jesus concluded, in your opinion, which one of these acted like the neighbor towards the man attacked by the robbers? The teacher of the law answered, the one who was kind to him. Jesus replied, go then and do the same. Do you see the sarcasm? This Jewish scholar hates Samaritans so much, he will not even say it was the Samaritan who did it. That's how much he hated him. This is why he's so angry with Jesus, because Jesus takes his worst enemy and he makes him the hero of the story. What about the people in Creekwood? What about illegals? What about politicians in our parties? What about Muslims? What about people on welfare? What about people that are tattooed and body pierced? Are we going to love them? They're our neighbors. They live here where we live. This story is about loving our neighbor. So I've got a challenge for you. I'm calling it the Southside Challenge. And here it is. This month, take the initiative to find people. And like the Good Samaritan, see them, listen to them, let your heart be filled with compassion for them, and then meet a need in their life. Find someone like that. At the bottom of your notes, I have this. Write down the name or a trait of the person you're going to start fulfilling the law of Christ with this month, which is loving your neighbors yourself. This month, the month of love, let's be a church that loves our neighbor as ourselves. That's what it means to love your neighbor. Let's pray.